Hi, everybody. Welcome to Daniel's on Research, Episode 2. I'm David Daniel.
I'm Daniel Willingham. Today we're going to take on an article titled Infusing Neuroscience into Teacher Professional Development by Janet Dubinsky. It's either Gillian or Jillian, Jillian or Gillian, Rohig and Sashank Varma. This is a 2013 article, so this is a little bit old, but David and I wanted to talk about it because it's got a couple of interesting features. It's got a fair amount of theoretical development up front where it talks about the general idea, the general project of infusing neuroscience into education. And then in the latter half of the article, they have an experiment where they actually tried to do it and ran some professional development sessions for teachers and evaluated the consequences of doing that.
So what they did is they took these concepts that they got from an SFN document.
SFN, Society for Neuroscience.
Right. Yeah. And they tried to say, here's what this might mean for teaching.
Right.
Then they developed this thing called Brain U.
Right.
Brain U is this...
It's a series of workshops.
It's a bunch of workshops for teachers, right?
And it's pretty elaborate. I mean, we think of PD as like, yeah, you go there for an afternoon, it's kind of boring, and there's a bad food set out, and that's it. You go home, forget about it. This totals like, I think, 160 hours of professional development spread out across 3 years. I think they did like 3 little intensive units of it. So it was, which is kind of cool. You can really have time to get into some content into depth.
Right, and what they were looking at was, did they learn neuroscience? Did they report learning neuroscience? And did it change their teaching?
Right.
Those are the sorts of things they were looking at. So I thought we'd start by just going over the core concepts from Society for Neuroscience, and then their interpretation of what this might mean for teaching.
For teaching, yeah.
Okay. So the core, I'll just do like 1, 2, and 5. Okay. The brain is the body's most complex organ. That's the core concept. And the general implication for teaching, according to the authors, the complexity of an organism's nervous system dictates the range of its behaviors. For science teaching, simpler nervous systems from model organisms provide opportunities to study how nervous systems work.
Okay.
Okay, that's a teaching and learning implication. Number 2. Neurons communicate using both electrical and chemical signals.
That's a core concept in neuroscience.
And the implications for teaching and learning, the plasticity of chemical synaptic transmission provides a cellular basis for learning and memory. Communication between neurons is strengthened or weakened by patterns of use. All perceptions, thoughts, and behaviors result from combination of signals amongst neurons. I just got to say, I don't know how that's a teaching and learning implication.
Right. It's not clear to me. I'm with you. It's not clear to me that if I were thinking, okay, I'm teaching geometry tomorrow, and I'm feel a little at sea about what to do, that reading that implication would say, oh, that actually gives me some good ideas.
Yeah, see where they're getting at, because at the end, in the discussion, what they're really saying is learning about the process of plasticity helps teachers dig in and do a better job. Really, the whole thing's revolving around plasticity.
Right.
But I think they're interpreting as a metaphor more so than the actual physical plasticity.
Right. And so they put it in terms of the actual neuroscientific basis of plasticity, but then they'd like for teachers to be thinking about it one level more abstract. Why don't you read one more?
Right.
Sorry?
You change brains, teachers.
You change brains, exactly. Yeah, kids change brains themselves as well. Why don't you read one more, and then people listening and watching can sort of listen for the plasticity bit in this final one that you read.
Right. Yeah, this one's interesting. I'm going to do this one about intelligence because I find it fascinating.
Okay.
Intelligence arises as the brain reasons, plans, and solves problems.
That's the core concept.
Right. The teaching and learning implication, the brain is the foundation of the mind. Intelligence in all domains reflects the accumulated history of synaptic activation amongst the multiple brain pathways involved. In other words, practicing creative or deductive thinking facilitates further use of these strategies.
I see a comment in your eyes, even though you're not saying anything.
I see a major publication redefining what intelligence is.
Yeah. So we should mention there are 8 of these in total. David's read 3. And I mean, I think his reaction and my reaction is the same, which is these the concepts are fine as far as they go, the core concepts. The link between the core concepts and the what it's supposed to mean for the classroom is pretty tenuous in the first place. And in the second place, the statement of what this means for the classroom seems really vague to me and doesn't seem like it would be of much practical utility. Before we talk about the results, so this is the basis for the Brain U, that the PD that they're going to provide folks. Before we talk a little bit about the results of the study, I want to read from the third paragraph of this article where it says, far from abstract background material, the core concepts of neuroscience represent practical knowledge that has the potential to inform teacher practice in classroom settings, as well as to motivate students to learn.
That's a strong statement.
It really is. Yeah.
And it's subject to huge debate before then and even now.
And as David said a moment ago, I mean, I think that in truth, when you look at how the PD played out, it doesn't feel like that's even really what they were trying to do. They were trying to use this much more high-level concept of plasticity to motivate a bunch of practices that I think, most educators would actually say, like, yeah, I mean, that's a reasonable way to go in terms of thinking about how to improve classroom practice.
Yeah, so in a way, they kind of use the neuroscience as a Trojan horse as a way to dress these things up and slip them in there to have you engage in them in a different way than you had before.
Yeah, well put. So do you want to say a word or two about the outcomes? We've given a sketch, and I don't think we need more than that, of sort of what the method was. You had across these 3 workshops, each workshop being fairly intensive and lengthy, an effort to teach some basic neuroscience, but then also to teach some pedagogy. That's really important to be clear about that. They weren't just teaching them parts of the brain and teaching them neural signaling. They were also talking about actually what teachers ought to be doing in the classroom, pedagogical techniques.
Yeah, they found that the teachers purported learning more. They found that the teachers did learn more about neuroscience, about their neuroscience. They found that the teachers taught more neuroscience and in their classes, and they found that they taught differently after the intensive Brain U workshops.
Right, and it's important to note too, that part was not self-report. They actually had observers go into the classrooms and observe the teaching. And some of the things they had been encouraging teachers to do by ways of changing their pedagogy, the teachers were actually doing.
Right. And when this came out, it actually got a lot of attention.
It did, yeah. And you can sort of see why. But David, do you want to start off on sort of now your take on how you would think about those findings?
There's a few things. One is, I think intensive training in anything would create a situation where you're more likely to change your teaching, right? We don't have a pre and post of learning outcomes to know if the teaching is more effective. We know that the teaching changed in line with what they wanted them to do. If what they wanted to do was effective, we don't know. So that's the big thing for me. Did it actually transfer into student learning and student impact? The other thing is the whole idea that neuroscience can directly inform pedagogy is something that is so debatable, and a strong statement like that before there's much data on that it could be seen as reckless or inspirational or aspirational, I should say, but this does not show that. It does not show that a finding in an fMRI or knowing something about the brain leads to something that makes you a better teacher, except for the idea that this makes me a better teacher. Does that make sense? It
totally makes sense. And I'm what I was going to say sort of combines the two things that you were saying. I agree with you. It's very hard to know what was going on in this study. I mean, I believe the data that they were getting these outcomes, teachers were changing their practice. Part of it, as we said, was that it may have nothing to do with the neuroscience and mostly to do with the ways that they were getting them to think in new ways about pedagogy. And the neuroscience was all incidental. But the broader point that you were making is that it maybe could have been pretty much anything that kind of makes sense to teachers. I mean, no one's going to listen to nonsense, but if it seems to hang together, even if what I'm saying as you're a teacher and receiving it doesn't 100% make sense to you, if it kind of does, you're examining your own practice and you're thinking about the ways you do things. And it's both energizing and it gets you thinking in ways that you maybe hadn't thought before. And that's a reason why seeing these types of studies is so common, where you've got a group of people who does some PD, they want to show the PD works, and it does kind of work, but it doesn't really go any farther than that. I mean, for one thing, what you would need here, what you'd like to see to sort of defend against what David and I said, we're offering as a counterinterpretation, you'd like to see an active control group. You'd like to see a second group of teachers who went through some workshops that the researchers think actually isn't really going to help their practice. And I know that sounds terrible, where you're giving teachers PD, and obviously
I want to do that now.
You have to. No, but I mean, obviously you have to have informed consent. People have to know, that they're in an experiment and that that's a possibility. But to make this really persuasive, that's really what you need. And maybe we should do like a whole vlog on the need for active control groups. And
there's one on the science of learning that came out last year, maybe, where they did training in the science of learning, the retrieval practice spacing, the usual stuff, compared to teaching about content knowledge. And they found effects for the teaching of the science of learning, not the fairest comparison. Teaching how to teach versus what to teach is going to have a different outcome in the way you teach, but they're getting there, right? Another one would be nice is to throw into the nothing will work is science of learning versus the neuroscience.
Right. That would be interesting.
It might be the training in the newest, hottest thing. It could have been learning styles 15 years ago, whatever, makes you reflect and change your teaching for the better.
Right. Well, is there anything else that you want to comment on regarding the study before we maybe talk a little bit more about, elaborate on what you were referring to earlier about why you're suspicious that it's going to be really difficult to sort of cross the bridge between neuroscience and education?
No, I think this was a very impactful study when it came out. It got a lot of press. It got a lot of attention, and it's something we can use as a springboard. And by the way, what we're saying isn't to disparage anybody who did the study or the interpretation. It's just to say, can you really get there from here? You got somewhere. We got somewhere. That's not bad.
Right.
All science moves you someplace. So
no, well, absolutely. And I mean, this was a carefully done study. And I was actually going to say, when you said they don't have any measures of student learning. They have observations that the teachers really did teach differently and didn't just report that their practice has changed. Just in doing that, these authors have sort of gone a step beyond what most researchers have done. Because usually what you're thinking is, okay, one step at a time, I'm going to do this PD. I'll see, first of all, let me just see whether people learn it, or is the way I'm doing the PD not very effective and people aren't even learning. So that would be my first step. Then my second step, do you think it changes your practice? Then I might, go even further and so on. So I definitely don't ding them for the fact that they didn't demonstrate changes to student outcomes. That's obviously you'd want to see that down the road, but it is a carefully done study and certainly interesting in its own right. There's a couple of aspects to this relationship between neuroscience and classroom that I want to elaborate on. We've hinted a little bit at both of them. One is this idea, that the Trojan horse idea that, as you put it, that you can use some neuroscientific findings to get people to think about things differently. And the plasticity has been really big in this. Carol Dweck has used this in getting people to think about mindset. There's some sense in which people, because the brain is physical, it seems more real maybe to some people than behavioral science does. And so the idea that you are changing kids' brains, kids are capable of changing their own brains, sounds more motivating than just saying, people learn. And I think there's something to that. Honestly, this idea has been around for 10 years. I've always felt a little bit funny about it because there's a smidge that feels slightly dishonest to me. because it's like it's not just, for reasons actually I guess we're going to describe in a moment. The bridge is not that straightforward, and it's mostly that you're trying to get people motivated and you're trying to get them excited, but it's in the guise that the neuroscience part is really important. That's one thing I wanted to mention, is that it's always felt a little funny to me. I don't know if you felt that way, David.
Well, yeah, because when you think about it from the perspective of mind-brain education, which is interdisciplinary or transdisciplinary, but it's multiple disciplinaries, right? Yeah. Neuroscience has its place. When we talk about it as neuroscience first all the time, given where we're at with neuroscience, that you just can't do that. Right. So to use neuroscience to sneak in other ideas, for example, people are talking about neuroscience when they're really talking about encoding. They're using it as a way to talk about other things, I called it like a brain incarnation.
Right.
They use the brain to reincarnate some old ideas and make them sound fresh again. So it feels a little dishonest.
Right. I guess I just wanted to talk about this idea, and we've alluded to it several times. We should maybe be more specific about why we keep saying there's this bridge. It's like you can't really go directly from neuroscience to behavior. Do you want to take a stab at elaborating on that, about why we say so sort of breezily that that's not possible?
Well, it's not possible because the same way you can't go from genetics to behavior. As you get even if I study individual cells in the brain and then I start to look at circuits, right? Every time I up my level of analysis, I'm talking about a different level of interaction, different kinds of things influencing it, recruiting different things. By the time I get to cognition, there's a lot going into that. You got motivation, and then I get to behavior. That's a whole other bunch of stuff, and that's being influenced by all these other things. So as you move up your level of complexity, your level of analysis, you have to change the actual principles, the way you're discussing them. That's one of them. It's a really big one. It's just a levels of analysis issue.
Yeah, and I'll offer another metaphor that to elaborate on the levels of analysis problem. What I always offer is think about a tutor who's tutored for many years, is matchless at tutoring individual children and is just terrific at it. Now you ask that tutor to become a classroom teacher. How are they going to do? And the answer is, well, some of what they know as a tutor is clearly going to transfer, but they're facing new problems. And that's because a classroom is not 28 kids. It's its own thing. This is what's meant by level of analysis. You start getting all these interactions, you get new problems that aren't the product of any one child. They're the product of interactions among these kids. So that's one thing, and that David was talking about. I would offer that there's really a second problem as well. So in one publication, I talked about what we're talking about now is the vertical problem. As you're moving up in levels of complexity, there's also a horizontal problem, which is that the jump from neuro to behavior is really qualitatively different. Yeah. Behavioral scientists deal with different types of data. And so if you're, a behavioral researcher, you study memory, and I study neuroscience, and I come to you with some, single cell recording data, you're like, well, that's great, but my theory is all deals with behavior. I don't really know what to do with this. And sort of trying to bridge that gap has been the subject of behavioral neuroscience for the last, whatever it is, at least 75 years or more. And if we had solved the problem, if we had broken the neural code, that wouldn't be a problem. You could look at neurons firing and you have some idea of what it means, but that problem isn't solved. Where that's active scientific investigation.
It's premature, and that's why mind-brain education built it into the cake as being a contributor, but not a hierarchy where it's the contributor. To leave it out would have been a mistake. But to give it too much authority in this situation would have been a mistake too. Right?
So maybe in another episode, we'll find an article where we think they're doing a great job of doing this integration, and we can give some examples that are positive.
Yeah, and it's going to be iterative. But the other issue is if I'm a teacher, I've heard this at conferences, people say, we're going to get to a day when you teach somebody and you'll be able to look at their brain and instead of give them a test to know if they know it. I've heard that at several. No, Number one, expensive, but number two,
Creepy.
right? Yeah. But just because there's changes in the brain that are correlated with what you think it should look like, if they still can't do it, then as a teacher, you're not being successful.
Right.
Right. So as a teacher, I need them to be able to show they've learned this stuff, can do this thing, whatever it is I'm trying to do. That's my level of analysis. That's my currency as a teacher.
Right.
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 So,
Or to put it another way, if you have a child who can't read, and then the teacher teaches the child to read, and here comes the neuroscientist and said, well, I did their brain scan and I'm not seeing that they can read. Who cares? Like, the proof that you really care about is the behavior. It's whether or not the child can read.
right. So, what my level of analysis and my currency at the level of practice that I deal with is important. And I shouldn't be outsourcing that to somebody who has a different goal and different levels of analysis.
Right. Yeah, well put. Anything else that you want to offer on this article?
No, this has been fun.
Let's wrap episode 2 in that case.
Great.
Thank you,
Thanks
Daniel.
for everybody. Appreciate it.
Cheers.
Yeah.